Hey guys, it's Mr. Hefner again, and I'm coming to you from under the beautiful northern lights. They are absolutely gorgeous here in the Klondike region up near Alaska. And I'm coming to you today from that region because we're going to be reading a story that takes place in that setting. It's a story by Jack London. Now, you may know Jack London for stories like White Fang or The Call of the Wild, but we're going to read a story. It's a short story, not a short novel. It's a short story about kind of like traveling and trying to survive in cold weather, but not cold weather like anything we experience around here. I remember about a year ago, I pulled into the school parking lot in the morning. It was the coldest day of that year, and I looked down at my dash and I could see the temperature, and it said 4 degrees below zero. Not below freezing, but below zero. We're going to be reading a story today where the temperature is more than 50 degrees below zero. Imagine being outside in that. All right, let's get started. Today's story is called To Build a Fire, because in temperatures that are below 50 degrees below zero, a fire is something that would be pretty nice to have around. And our story was written by Jack London. Jack London's an interesting guy. He struggled a lot in his life to find the right job, to find a living, and he found that the best thing he could do to make money was to become a writer. Even though he always claimed that he hated the job of being a writer, he had the talents for it. And one of the things he did at one point in his life was he went north to the Klondike region. Now, we've had a bunch of gold rushes over the years. There was one in 1849 in California. That's why the team is called the 49ers, and people rushed out to California for gold. But there was another one closer to the end of the 19th century up in the Klondike region, the frozen areas of northwestern Canada and eastern Alaska. And so you can imagine when people get gold fever and they rush off just to make their fortune, they're rushing off into very, very dangerous territory. And in many cases, these people had no idea what they were doing. There were deaths in very high numbers, but it was gold fever. And sometimes people do anything to get gold. Now, our topic today is the title of the story. It's going to be To Build a Fire. It's by Jack London. And our lesson essential question for today is going to be, how does Jack London use just about everything? We're going to just break this story down. How does he use setting? All right. So remember, setting is its place and its time, right? Both of those things. Conflict. What's going to be the conflict in here if it's one man trying to survive alone in the wilderness? Maybe that word survive is a hint. What's the plot? This is going to be a different kind of story here because we're used to seeing one character against another character. But here we have that kind of survival thing. If you've ever read any of the Gary Paulson stories with Brian trying to survive in the wilderness, you know what I'm talking about. And then one last thing. Down here, I'll turn this yellow. There's a concept in literature called naturalism. Right? It became popular after the Civil War with a lot of writers. And the idea with naturalism, it sounds on the surface like, oh, it must have something to do with nature. And it does. But it's not just simply about getting outside and smelling flowers and noticing the fresh air. It's the idea that nature has certain rules about it. And sometimes bad things happen to good people, not because they did something wrong, not because they made stupid decisions or they deserve it, but just because in the world of nature, good things happen, bad things happen, and sometimes we don't understand just why. So we'll look for examples of naturalism in this story today as well. This story was published in 1908. So it was published around the same time as some of the other stories that we've read, like The Monkey's Paw. And it's one of 28 stories that Jack London wrote in something he called his Northland Saga. They were stories of the people and the time period in the Klondike during that gold rush. He wrote some plays. His novels tend to be very short, but this is just a short story that we're going to look at today. Now, let me get back to this naturalism. So To Build a Fire is a great example of naturalism. It was a literary movement. So a movement is when a bunch of writers are getting on board and they're trying something new. It might be a technique, might be a style, or it might be a way of seeing the world. And I think in the case of this story, it's a way of seeing the world a little bit differently. Now, it started in the late 19th century and it went into the early 20th centuries. And just to clear that up, sometimes people see 19th and they think 1900s, but the 1800s are the 19th century and the 1900s are the 20th century. That's because before we got to 100, 0 to 99 was the first century. So by the time you get to 100, you're already in the second century here. And here's the idea. Often forces in nature are beyond the comprehension or the control of the characters. Stuff happens, and we don't understand why, and sometimes we just don't know how to deal with it. Now, one of the ironies in this story, there's going to be a dog, and the dog is almost a character. Keep your eyes out. When it comes to certain things, animals have only their instincts. Human beings have all this ability to reason and think and predict. Animals have just instincts. And yet, I can tell you, if I took a 14-year-old and just plucked that 14-year-old out of his house and put him in the woods and said, now, survive for a couple months, there's a good chance he wouldn't, right? On the other hand, if I took a 1-year-old cat and I took it out of somebody's house and I put that cat in the woods, there's a really good chance that cat would survive. There's something about instincts that help creatures survive when reason doesn't always work. All right. The historical connection, I told you a little bit about this here. The time period is the gold rush, and it's the gold rush in the Klondike. The Klondike is a river that runs in northwestern Canada. And rivers are kind of important to this time period for a couple reasons. One, in the wintertime, rivers freeze in that part of the country. And so it becomes a place where you can take your dog sled and you can literally travel on top of the snow, and it's faster than going through the forest. You can't do that in the summer. You'd have to have boats at that point. But the other thing is rivers tend to flow, they don't flow over the top of mountains. And so if you can follow a river, it's a way to travel without having to cross super high peaks of mountains, which would be dangerous. All right. This is Jack London again. He's born in 1876. How can you remember that date? Well, think about that. It's the 100th birthday of America, right? 1776, Declaration of Independence. 100 years later, we're all very proud that America has survived its first century. We're celebrating, and Jack London gets born. Look at this. He does not live a very long life. This poor man lives to be only 34 years old. So he dies quite young, and it's kind of a tragedy because I like to think sometimes of what other great stories Jack London might have written if he could. I'm not going to go through all of this here because we're not really doing an author study today. But like I said, he had a bunch of experiences. By 18, he worked in a cannery. Canneries are always in the areas where, in San Francisco, California, along the Pacific coast, where you would basically work on an assembly line, making sure that seafood products got into cans and that they were packed up safely, hence the name a cannery. He actually worked pulling up the pirates. He worked on a ship for a while. One of his great short novels is called, I can't think of it right now. It'll come to me. But I want to say The Sea Dog, but it wasn't The Sea Dog. It's a story about a captain who actually rescues some people and then forces them into serving him on his ship. So he did a whole bunch of jobs. I'm not going to ask you what all these things were, but just remember, the more things a writer does when he's young, the more experience he has when he's older. And he eventually went back to California. He went to a university. He started taking English classes, worked as a newspaper reporter for a while. But as I said, he found his real money in writing these stories about the Klondike region. And by the time he gets back, after all of this kind of stuff, he writes for the Atlantic Monthly. Now, the Atlantic Monthly was probably the most prestigious magazine of its time. It's still around. Today, it's just called The Atlantic because they're online, so they're not just monthly, but they're daily. And they're still a very respected magazine. He got paid a flat fee, $120 for a story called The Odyssey of the North. That's not one of his more famous ones today, but it helped him break through. And as I said, here are some of his famous novels. We already mentioned Call of the Wild. I already mentioned White Fang. And the one that I couldn't think of, I was going to say The Sea Dog. It's actually The Sea Wolf. I was close, right? Wolves are dogs, or dogs are wolves. No, dogs aren't wolves, but wolves are dogs. So those are probably his most famous ones that he had. And I just have a couple pictures to show you. These are some old 19th century photographs. When you went into the Klondike region, it was a very deadly, deadly place. You had to go in well supplied. You had to have food, you had to have your dog team, you had to have good warm clothing. And you wanted to be one of the first people to get in that season, because once you found gold, you could stake your claim, which basically said you could register the plot of land that you were going to work. If someone else got there ahead of you, that's a claim that you can't have. And so you wanted to start going when the rivers were still frozen, but were about to start thawing. Because I said it was easiest to travel when they're frozen, but it's also most dangerous to travel in deep winter. Now, you know that even in springtime, after you have a couple nice days, you can sometimes get a day where the temperature dips very low all of a sudden. But this is actually a picture of an area called the Chilkoot Pass. You notice how the mountains are really high up here, and here you can pass through, and these are just individual people, one by one by one by one, heading into the Klondike region, because this was where you entered into that Klondike region. Crazy. You know, looking at that picture, some of them never came back. And this is a map of the Klondike region. So there were two major trails that people used to get in and get the gold. The one was called the Daia Trail, and the other was the Skagway Trails. And so this is the area of the whole Klondike region here. You know what a sled dog looks like, but you would have had a whole team of sled dogs. Now, think about this question. People give us advice all the time, right? I try not to give advice, but I find myself doing it anyway. How do you know when to listen to someone's advice and when it's best not to listen to someone's advice and follow your own ideas instead? I don't have an answer to that. That's like, if I had an answer to that, I would have solved all of life's problems, because I would have looked for good advice and followed it and ignored my own ideas when I knew they were going to fail. But sometimes you pick wrong. So think about that. What if your survival depends on making the right choice? All right, in To Build a Fire, we're going to look for some literary tools. Like always, we're going to pay close attention to setting. Now, this is a story that lacks dialogue. We have one protagonist in this story, and he has no one to speak to. He's got his dog with him, and every once in a while some words escape his lips. You know, you're probably by yourself from time to time, and you talk to yourself out loud with, oh, why didn't I do that, kind of thing. But he has no one really to speak to except his dog, and you have the dog. So we got to focus on the setting, and it's going to involve things like the time period. So it's going to be the Klondike, the time of the year, the weather that we have right now, whether it's day or night. All of these things are going to help create a mood for this whole story. So we're going to pay close attention to the setting. And the other thing we're going to look at is plot, as always. This would seem like, well, if it's just one person, how can we have a plot? But we have a very well-developed plot in this story. And we're going to look for conflict. Okay, now, conflict, as we talked about before, as some of you read your O. Henry stories, and you said, I don't think there's an antagonist here. Sometimes there isn't. If there is an antagonist, your antagonist is usually involved in the conflict. But sometimes, if you look at the definition here, it doesn't say it's a struggle between two people. It's a struggle between two forces. And your protagonist may be one force trying to accomplish some goal, but there may be something else standing in the way, like bad weather or a storm or something like that. So we're going to look for that. Our protagonist in this story may be struggling against something like nature, something that he can't control, but you still have to struggle against it if you want to survive. All right, as you read the story, and I've got some audio for you, but as you read the story, I want you to look for ideas of this concept of naturalism. The man is thinking, he's trying to figure things out, but there are just things out of his control. And maybe he can't avoid the good things or the bad things that are going to happen to him in this story. Maybe he's just bouncing along with the events that are happening. And then the other thing I'd like you to do is look for plot. You know, look for exhibition if you can find it. You look for the inciting incident, rising action. Where do you think the climax occurs in this story? Where is the high point of the action? Where does the story get resolved, right? The resolution. And is there some denouement? Is there a little something after the story's been resolved? And by resolved, I mean that the conflict no longer exists. So stories can be resolved when the person achieves and defeats the conflict. Sometimes you lose and the conflict, defeats the protagonist. But other times things happen like a protagonist may change his mind and decide, I no longer want what I wanted, I learned a better lesson, and I'm going to forget about that. It's not so much a loss, but as a redirection. But the simple answer to what I just said is, as long as the conflict exists, the story can't be over. The resolution of the story has to come at the end of the conflict. Pay attention to the setting. Great descriptions in this story of the setting. And then, as I said, the conflict is part of the whole plot, so we're good there. And again, Handbook of Literary Terms. At the end of this, you should be able to discuss this concept of naturalism and how we see Jack London exploring the idea that maybe people aren't always the godlike creatures we think we are. Maybe free will doesn't always save us. Maybe sometimes we're just victims of our environments. And then finally, we talked about this before, plot and conflict. You should be able to discuss these when you're finished. All right, so that's our introduction to Jack London and to Build a Fire. When we get to the story, I have some audio for you and a little surprise later on, but we have a film that follows the story very closely with a few changes. So one of the things you're going to have to do is pay careful attention to the written story, because that's our literature, and make sure that in the end you're not citing the movie when you really need to be citing the story. All right, let's get started on this story.